Imagine, for a moment, the warm rays of the afternoon sun creeping through the towering arches of the Colosseum, glistening off the marble columns and casting long shadows over the bustling streets of ancient Rome. The scent of freshly baked bread fills the air as merchants call out their wares and soldiers march with purpose. You're standing in the center of a world that, at its peak, controlled vast territories stretching from the sands of Egypt to the misty hills of Britain. The city hums with the power of the greatest empire the world has ever known. But wait, just as you begin to settle in, there's a soft whisper, like a murmur in the crowd. "You probably won't make it through this day," the voice says. Maybe that's a good thing, though. After all, you're here to experience a journey through time, one that traces the fall of this very empire. Before we begin, hit the like button and subscribe, so you don't miss any part of this thrilling tale. And while you're here, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Let's share this adventure together. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. Rome, the beating heart of the ancient world, seems eternal, doesn't it? Like the sun that rises each morning, or the streets that have long echoed the steps of emperors and slaves alike. But look closer, and you might see the cracks beneath the surface. Rome, for all its grandeur, wasn't invincible. And over time, the empire began to show signs of weakness that could no longer be ignored. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the cracks began to show. Was it in the reign of the infamous Emperor Nero, with his grandiose projects and lavish, wasteful lifestyle? Or perhaps it started with the rule of Commodus, whose reign was marred by corruption and incompetence. Historians still debate when exactly the rot set in, but one thing is for certain, it wasn't a sudden event. No, it was more like a slow, creeping vine that, over centuries, suffocated the empire's foundations. The empire's military, once a finely tuned machine, began to falter. At its height, the Roman legions were an unstoppable force, but over time, as the empire expanded, the borders became harder and harder to defend. The vast stretch of Roman territory, once secured by a loyal and disciplined army, now had to be protected by a patchwork of mercenaries. And these mercenaries? Well, they weren't always loyal. Loyalty is a funny thing when it's bought with gold, after all. And when it was the gold of a crumbling empire, well, loyalty became even harder to find. But it wasn't just the military. The economy was faltering too. Rome, once a land of wealth and innovation, was now struggling under the weight of inflation, high taxes, and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. The once thriving trade routes that had brought luxury goods from the farthest corners of the empire were now being choked by constant raids and internal strife. Rome's silver coin, once the symbol of power and prosperity, now carried less and less value. It's almost as if the empire's wealth had been spent too quickly, like someone who had a mountain of gold but no real plan to keep it from slipping through their fingers. You may think, but surely the mighty Romans had a plan, right? Well, sometimes the plan isn't enough. Rome, like any empire, was a collection of people, each with their own desires and flaws. And as the empire grew, so did its problems. With its vast population, Rome began to experience what we might call a brain drain today. The smartest minds, the brightest innovators, started leaving the city, and fewer young men were willing to join the legions. After all, who wants to fight in a war when there's no money, no glory, and no future? And then, there were the external threats. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns. These names are now synonymous with destruction, but in Rome's day, they were the barbarians pounding at the gates. The great Roman walls that once stood as a symbol of invulnerability were now failing, crumbling under the pressure of invaders from beyond the empire. And as the barbarians grew bolder, the Romans were left scrambling for answers. One of the most iconic moments in this saga is the sacking of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoths under their king, Alaric. It was the first time in over 800 years that the city had fallen to an enemy. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the humiliation. Rome had survived countless wars, civil unrest, and political upheaval, but now, the very walls that had once protected the city were breached. The once proud empire had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, but don't mistake this for the empire's final death knell. No, that would come later. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to hold out for nearly another 1,000 years, maintaining the legacy of Rome even after the fall of the West. But the Western Roman Empire, as we know it, was in its final days. Now that we've set the stage, let's step forward into the slow descent of a once glorious civilization. Feel the warmth of the Mediterranean sun slipping behind the horizon, casting the remnants of Rome in a soft, orange glow. This is the twilight of an empire. Rome had always been about power. But what happens when the empire's power starts to slip away, when the very foundations of its government begin to tremble? The emperors, once regarded as godlike figures, were now seen by many as corrupt and weak. The idea of the good emperor became a distant memory, a relic of a bygone era. By the time the Western Roman Empire truly fell, the line between emperors and usurpers had blurred. The title of emperor was often passed around like a game of musical chairs, with no one truly holding the reins for long enough to make a lasting impact. One of the most famous of these was the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But let's not get too attached to him. He's often considered the last of the puppet emperors, with little real power, only to be replaced by the barbarian Odoacer in 476 AD, But what led to the final collapse? What sealed the fate of this once unbeatable empire? For one, the lack of strong leadership left the empire vulnerable to internal strife. The empire's vastness, once its strength, became a liability. Political corruption spread like wildfire, weakening the governing systems. Without a clear direction, Rome was left to fend for itself against external threats, internal instability, and its own crumbling structure. Economically, Rome's dependence on slave labor left it unprepared for the evolving world. Trade routes were interrupted by barbarian invasions, and a lack of resources meant that the once thriving cities could not support themselves. People began to migrate out of the cities in search of better opportunities, leaving the heart of the empire in a state of decay. And let's not forget the cultural shift that was taking place. Roman citizens, once proud of their heritage, were increasingly disconnected from their roots. They no longer saw themselves as Romans first, but as subjects of an empire that was increasingly alien to them. The once solid foundation of Roman values and traditions was slowly eroded, replaced by new ideas and new ways of thinking. As the empire faltered, the barbarians pushed forward. The Huns, led by the fierce Attila, became one of the most formidable forces to challenge the Romans. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, would eventually breach the walls of Rome itself. The Vandals would follow, and soon, the once glorious city of Rome would be nothing but a shadow of its former self. The fall of Rome was not a single event, but a culmination of years of neglect, decay, and external pressure. It's easy to think of the fall of Rome as a dramatic, single moment, but it was more like the slow, inevitable collapse of a building that had been weakened by time, bad decisions, and too many cracks in its foundation. As the final days of Rome slip away into the pages of history, we're left with the echoes of what once was a magnificent empire, brought to its knees by its own weaknesses. But perhaps that's the lesson in all of this. Empires, no matter how great, are not immortal. They rise, they shine, and eventually, they fall. But in their fall, they leave behind a legacy, a warning and a reminder for the future. As you drift off into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll find yourself walking the crumbling streets of Rome, imagining what it might have been like to witness the empire's last breaths. Take that with you, for Rome's fall isn't just a story of the past, it's a lesson that resonates with us, even today.